where DEI feels lost and inclusion is becoming a bad word, we are having real conversations about leadership through the lenses of diverse voices. Hi, I'm Nicki Straza. I am a certified flourishing facilitator and coach who specializes in helping different generations get along at work.
And I'm Sherri, Dockree, an ICF certified coach, facilitator, and leadership consultant specializing in ADHD, neurodiversity, and well-being for leaders and executives. We are your hosts, and this is the Dissonance Disrupted podcast, empowering leaders to navigate from discomfort to dialogue.
Welcome back to the Dissonance Disrupted podcast. We are so happy to have you with us. Thanks for coming back and checking us out. My name is Nicki Straza, and I'm here with my lovely co-host, Sherri.
Good day. How are you?
Doing really well.
Good.
We're going to talk about psychological safety today, which is such a broad topic, but there are so many kind of nuances to it. And when we think about psychological safety, and I mean, you and I teach this in our workshops, we work with so many different groups around this topic. I think it's something that is still not well understood. And I think it's something that often is miscategorized as a cognitive function. And I'm hoping today we can kind of explore what is at the root of psychological safety and why it's not just mental assent that's required to create psychological safety, but it goes much deeper and it's a much more physiological kind of response. And dig into the science a little bit. Are you game?
I'm game.
All right. Well, that sounds fun. Tell me a little bit from your work experience as you teach this to organizations. What are some of the misconceptions that people have about psychological safety?
I think there are actually quite a few. And the first one that stands out most frequently to me is the fact that when we go into organizations, their worry is that by engaging in the conversations about psych health and safety, they're now taking ownership and full responsibility of the psychological health and safety of all of their employees. And I think it's really key to be able to unpack that with employers and organizations right from the beginning. So this expectation that now they own it, I mean, that's got to be terrifying to imagine, you know, depending on the size of the organization. Sometimes you're talking to an organization with 50 people. Sometimes you're talking to an organization with 5,000 people. That's a lot of people you have to worry about. So to imagine that you're responsible for something so intangible as psychological health and safety is really the thing that I think most employers kind of have that panic attack almost right from the beginning. And so my approach with that is always talking about how we can create the environment for them. We can establish the guardrails. We can provide them the opportunities. But at the end of the day, if they're choosing not to take ownership, if they're choosing not to engage with it, that's a choice. But we can't own that. We can only own what we can do. I always say we are 100% responsible for all of our actions and reactions. So as an employer, they are 100% responsible. But as a team member, I'm also 100% responsible. So it's not a 50-50. And so I think that's the first piece that shows up really strongly. I think beyond that, though, it's also the complexity of it. If you look at the Psych Health and Safety model from the Mental Health Commission of Canada, it is complex, right? There's all these factors and you have to figure out how to build them all in. And if you're in an organization that's large, you've got multiple departments and there's different issues in every department. So that complexity is also unnerving for a lot of people. But I really think that there's also this understanding that it's very task-oriented. Right? Like it's about, oh, we have to do this task. Now we have to do this task. Now we have to do this task to get us to that point where we can check off all the boxes and say, okay, we've done all the things. And that task-oriented side of things is important, but it's missing the part that actually works. It's the part where we actually talk to people, uncover what it is that creates safety for them, what is creating an optimal work environment for them, and then how do we ensure that we're giving more of that? And we bring in that positive psychology perspective that I know is really rooted in everything that you do. So I think those really stand out to me as things that I've encountered and that have created barriers for organizations who are thinking about how do we create this. But I'm curious because you approach this really differently. So tell me what your experience has been.
Well, I think the myth that I love to bust in the work that I do is that this is a cognitive process, that this is somehow a logical, we just have to get people with the right information to behave in a certain way. And I think the thing we miss about psychological health and safety is that it isn't a cognitive exercise, it is a physiological one. And our sense of being safe is not a thought, it is a feeling. And you and I have worked in the corporate world long enough to know that feelings, we really love feelings in the workplace. And
Workplaces don't love feelings, though.
That's true. And so I think one of my favorite kind of awarenesses to bring to this conversation is the fact that our neurobiology is actually what's leading the charge in whether something feels safe or not. And we can look at a situation and go, what is wrong with you? Of course, this is perfectly safe. And yet someone could be feeling very, very vulnerable. And it has nothing maybe even to do with this present moment, but it has something to do with a moment that feels a little similar from a time ago that they're now in the process of regulating. Right? Or maybe they don't even realize it. And there's so many layers to this. But when I start to recognize that, when we are in our prefrontal cortex, that's where our executive functioning is, our good judgment, our critical thinking, our ability to think outside the box. Our amygdala is our fight, flight, fawn, freeze, claw, something like that. That is our reactionary space. When we are safe and feel safe, we can function in executive function, our prefrontal cortex, all that good space. The moment our brains go, nope, this is safe, we go from being in our prefrontal cortex and we slam into our amygdala and we are immediately in fight, flight, fawn, freeze, and we're right into reaction. And the chemical response that is unleashed as a result of that actually prevents us from being in the prefrontal cortex until we get ourselves back to safety. And if we can't recognize when we ourselves or when others are in their amygdala rather than their prefrontal cortex, all of our logicking, attempts to try to logically bring somebody along on a cognitive journey is fruitless. And that causes frustration. So I think one of the really important things is to understand, what does that stress response look like in me? How do I behave? How does it function? How does it show up? Because it's different for all of us. And then how might it show up in others? And can we have a conversation about that and begin to recognize, okay. According to neuroscience, the brain is scanning every 5 seconds. Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? Is this safe? What about this? Oh, somebody just walked into the roof. Are they safe? And so all of this scanning, one little nuance, one little text, one little phone call can change that dynamic in a quick, hot second. I think just coming in with that awareness that there's a very physiological response to psychological safety that we often just skip right over to try and look at the pragmatic pros and cons of a situation in trying to solve it. And I think in making that leap, we're jumping over the humans and the humanness of the people involved. And I think that matters. And I think that's one of our missing loops. And so for me, it's that physiological response. Do you have any experience with that, or have you seen that show up in your work?
Yeah, quite a bit. And you're talking about that ability to work from the place of being in that prefrontal cortex and those logic and executive function centers. What's really interesting about that is the fact that when we are actually well balanced in that space, we have the capacity to switch back and forth. And that actually actually is really important. We have to be able to tap into those instincts and those past reflections to add context to the logic of what we're doing so often. And that really is what makes the difference between us and AI when it comes to working or engaging with other people. And I agree. I think that this is where now our expertise actually comes in as well around the generational diversity for you and the neurodiversity for me, because there are some specific nuances in these territories. At the very top end of the scale, for those who are in the neurodiverse world or experience neurodiversity, it's the things like rejection sensitivity we talk about, that heightened experience of emotions that the average person experiences emotions on a scale of 1 to 10, and we experience them on a scale of -50 to 150. And they're fast and they're intense and they linger for a long period of time. So if you're coming into a workplace scenario where there is that potential for threats, your experience is significantly heightened quite frequently. I recall going into situations where there was a need for me to be in an environment where I absolutely was aware I was not safe. I didn't feel safe in my team of other leaders. And the expectation is that I'm going to be able to contribute to what's going on in that moment. It's not a safe environment. And so I'm spending my time trying to figure out how to regulate my emotions in that moment and questioning, am I overreacting? Now that I reflect back, I know that actually it wasn't a psychologically safe environment. And so I wasn't really overreacting. I was typical ADHD reacting, but because it wasn't safe, it was impossible for me to focus my attention on the thing that needed to be focused on. So was my organization getting the best out of me? Absolutely not. So I know from my own personal experience what that looks and feels like, and with the clients that I work with, but it also shows up in other ways. So when we don't have clarity, that clarity in organizational leadership is really important. It is that ambiguity that makes it really tough for someone who is neurodivergent to figure out what to do next. I need that concrete step-by-step process. But I also need autonomy. I need to have the ability to make some of my own decisions and have that flexibility in that process, because that's what allows me to stay engaged, because I'm driven by a nervous system, right? And those who are neurodivergent typically are very nervous system driven attention. So if you want people to be attentive, you do have to give them structure, but you also have to give them a certain level of autonomy. And so you can see the complexity of working with someone who is neurodiverse, whose ADHD, for example, is not the same as another person who maybe is really good with just structure and following the instructions and just going along and not feeling as intensely what those emotions are. So that would be a really good example of where we might see that posing a challenge that's at a higher level than just your typical, we all need psychological health and safety in the workplace. When we're talking about neurodiversity, we're talking about a different experience entirely. And I know that that's also a complexity that crosses over with generational, but generational has its own separate kind of influences.
Yeah. Well, the truth of the matter is psychological safety to those who are, of our boomer cohorts or even our Gen X cohorts. Most boomers and Gen X can remember a good chunk of their career where psychological safety was never once mentioned at work. Never once. And in fact, the notion that you would mention psychological safety was because you were weak and sad and you couldn't get it together. Mm-hmm. So it came with all of this stigma that came through. But if we actually understand what boomers experienced work and what they were taught and what they were told was right, it's now understandable. And the same for our Gen Xers. So we now have this complexity where we have 4 to 5 different generations in the workplace who have a very visceral reaction to the notion of catering to someone's emotions in the workplace. Our younger generations, especially our Gen Zs, that is a non-negotiable. What do you mean you don't care about my emotions? If you don't care about my emotions, you don't care about me. And is that true? Maybe. Is it true that our emotions maybe have to have some regulation? Yes, that's also true. All things can be true, but they can be very opposite. And when we have generations in the workplace with different emotional intelligence strengths, different views of what is right and appropriate and professional in the workplace, I often get pushback when I'm talking about psychological safety and get this argument about what is professional and what is not professional. And yes, that's a mushy line, and that's where that clarity becomes really, really important. But the challenge is when we have all of this diversity of perspective on psychological safety, on what it means, we have to be able to peel back the rhetoric a little bit around what psychological safety is. It's not about bending and catering to people's emotions. It's not about not getting the job done. It really is about honoring the humanity and the dignity of the human in front of us to the same degree we want to be on. Mm-hmm. And that means we have to get a little curious about what that looks like, sounds like, talks like, behaves like, because it's different for each of us. I'm an ADHD person as well. It resonated so much with the story you were sharing. And my coping strategy for rejection sensitivity was to turn off my emotions and to completely mask. But then did my organizations and my people in my life get the best of me? No, they didn't. They got a shallow shell of an individual until I kind of, we won't get into that story. But here we have, again, curiosity that is needed at the root that says, I might have a sense of what is right, but in order to be good in this moment, I need to lean in and check in. And instead of assuming that they are reacting with malice, they are reacting because they just can't be bothered to work, they're reacting because of A, B, or C, and we can make up a ton of stories. Can we suspend that judgment and check in and see what's happening for that individual? So the generational dynamic plays a big role in our ability to create psychological safety at work. And it's critical that every generation understands both the strengths and the misunderstandings they bring to the workplace based on their generational, their learning, their context. As we think about that, and we think about safety, and we think about threat response, how do you guide leaders in helping them to discern that, helping them to increase their awareness in that regard?
Yeah, it's funny because the answer is actually not the one that sounds warm and fuzzy. It's actually the opposite. Because for adults especially, if we're going to teach them something new, we better tell them why they need to learn it to begin with. And so for some people, it is about, does it matter to you that you have a better relationship, like you show up as a boss differently, and that the people that you work with respect you and want to follow you, and that they are contributing because they care, not because they're feeling the need to be compliant. And so sometimes we have to talk about the business side of things. And so, yes, those are important pieces. But from the business side of things, when we see psychological health and safety not working, we see people who are, well, we've already talked about it, not doing their best. There's a glimmer that this person is capable of more, but for whatever reason, we just can't seem to pull it out of them. We see things like an impact on not just the work itself, but also things like, are they showing up on time? Are they calling in sick? How do they engage with change? And that can be a lot of things, but resistance to change is often because people are already experiencing a threat response to something that's happening in advance of suddenly changing something on them. So we often see leaders who will say, okay, well, clearly they can't handle this situation, so we're just going to do it this way. Well, that doesn't get to the root of it, right? That doesn't actually solve the issue. All you're doing is transferring the problem to a different scenario. So helping leaders to truly understand why it matters for them personally. And this is where I think you and I are a lot alike in the kinds of workshops that we do and the way that we approach this, because there is no canned answer. right? Like you need to sit down and you need to have that conversation with a human and understand who they are to figure out exactly what it is that's going on with them and why is this creating a threat response. And I often tell a story about a staff member that worked for me when I worked in the corporate sector, and she would go into this sort of panic mode whenever I came into that particular location. And I never understood it. I mean, I hired her, honestly. She was if I needed something done, I could call and say, can you do this? And she took care of it. But it was a threat-driven, people-pleasing behavior, not by me, but it was her way of being. She lived in this space of fear in employment at all times. Even after I left the organization, I hired her for my own company several years later. And I would get the exact same response from her. Even though we would have conversations, she knew how valued she was. She knew that the likelihood that I was ever going to fire her was slim to none. But that heightened stress was already there. It really wasn't about one person. It was about experiences. And I don't know that she was neurodivergent, but I do recognize that there may have been some traits. So when we talk about why, at the very beginning, why do leaders need to do this? That is that foundational piece that allows them to recognize, okay, there's a good reason for me to spend my time and energy and buy into this discussion. This isn't about dissing the woke culture. It's about how humans behave and how you are able to interact in a way that not only do you get the best out of them as an employer, but they're getting the best out of themselves. They can be proud of themselves. And in that state, someone is able to give so much more. That's the starting point. And from there, then it's often what the most painful points are, because those are the easiest points to identify. When I do values activities, I often start with pet peeves, because those are the pinch points. So let's start with the pinch points. What are they? What do you think they are? And when I think back to the beginnings of our conversation about this podcast, that was one of the big pieces. We have to be okay as leaders with being vulnerable and being uncomfortable and acknowledging it and facing it, to be able to then move ourselves into a space where we can help other people do the same thing. And I think when we talk about psych health and safety, we have to start there.
I so appreciate, and I feel like we've come around full circle because, you know, yes, leaders go first in creating psychological safety, but it takes everyone in the group to create that dynamic. We are only as safe as our weakest link. Right? And so, yes, as leaders, it's really, really important that we put in that effort to create an environment where safety can thrive. And we need to create an expectation of ourselves and each other that we are going to be safe people. Your story kind of highlighted there was some work to create safe environments and acknowledge and create safety around that employee's experience. And there's some responsibility on her part on how she can bring safety along with herself, healing those parts, acknowledging those areas, doing the therapy, doing whatever needs to be done to be able to bring safety and help your body know it's safe. And depending what you've been through in life, that's a tall order, and I will never diminish that. And that's just grace and mercy in that space, and I think that belongs. But psychological safety isn't something we do for other people. It's an environment first I have to create within myself, that then from that place of being a safe person, I create a culture of safety. If I am a judgmental person to myself, if I belittle myself and call myself names, my self-talk is as toxic as the day is long. Anything that I do in my performance out here is just that, a performance, and most people can see through it. So psychological safety begins with me, the leader. Am I a safe person with me? Is Nicki kind to Nicki?
Well, that brings up a really valid point, because when we think about whether or not people have the capacity to do those things, there are sometimes resources available for employers. There are sometimes none. Right. And that is really difficult, because it puts an employer in a position where they can create an environment, but that person doesn't have the capacity to access it. And I do think that there is limitations in those scenarios. And I think we have to be honest about that. Accessing those kinds of supports can be difficult. It can be expensive. It can be time consuming. It can also be a very difficult emotional, cognitive road that takes a toll, that then in the workplace, are they able to show up with what needs to be shown up with? And it's a really important point to be able to recognize that sometimes we have to figure out, is it more important for us to cut our losses with an employee and say, sorry, they're not meeting the expectation, and find someone new? Or is it more important to ride and weather the storm with them for a period of time and look for a way to retain that person? Because I do think that when employers prove themselves to be consistent and prove themselves to be caring, empathetic, and compassionate, but also have boundaries, but clear boundaries. Those are pieces that automatically start that bottom layer of psych health and safety. We can't be sure that everybody's going to come to the table. In the least idealistic scenarios, we don't know that everybody has the capacity to get to the table. And so, I mean, we're not going to answer that today, but it's the fact that we're starting the conversation. It's the fact that people are starting to contemplate that psych health and safety is maybe not what they thought it was. It's not, I have to turn myself inside out and become the therapist for my staff. It's not, we have to spend a small fortune now to fix everybody in the company's problems. It is really and truly just a philosophy that allows us to shift our approach. And I really appreciated what you said about how am I treating myself, because I recognized a long time ago that I didn't like who I was working in the corporate sector. That was a lot of why I left. I did not like who I was. And a lot of that was because from a corporate standpoint, there were goals and expectations and all of these things that needed to be met. And if you didn't meet them, you didn't get bonus, and you didn't have the bragging rights and all those sorts of things. That didn't make me a very kind person. And when I had to look in the mirror at that person, when I had to think about the person that my children were seeing, that was transformational in my mind about whether or not I belonged in that role. And we know that a lot of leaders are at a point where they're experiencing burnout, that they're not managing a lot of the things that are going on for them. They may be stuck in the role, but what's the damage that's being done by those jobs? So I have a lot of empathy for what that feels like as a leader, but I also know what that feels like as an employee. And I do think that when we can pause for a minute and put, as you say, that human element back into that equation, I think that it changes what we're talking about when we're talking about psychological health and safety. There's a lot of pieces around that. And I'm curious because there is so much overlap when we think about the whole Gen X thing. I'm like right on the cusp, and what that experience is about being someone who's Gen X, but also being someone who's ADHD. And when we start to put those layers on top, and I'm really curious what you find is one of the most impactful ways that you see leaders unpack that with their teams.
Oh, I want to make sure I'm catching your question well. Can you rephrase that?
So, knowing that there are those multi-layered experiences, right? We don't live in a silo. And so we have those intersectionalities. And so, working with the people that you work with, what are some strategies that you have worked with them to develop to help those leaders be able to peel back all of the layers, or at least be able to recognize when they need to peel back the layers?
I love that. And I have found that as leaders expand their knowledge and their awareness of different diversity aspects. So when you have context on different generations, all of a sudden you see a different generation in a different light. When you have context about neurodiversity, all of a sudden you have a different perspective and you ask different questions. And so being able to grow in knowledge, especially hearing other people's experiences, I think is really, really powerful. And one organization that I worked with, one of their strategies was absolutely brilliant. And they created, they have a cafeteria and a lunchroom, and they basically offered free lunch on the company, but the condition was you couldn't eat alone.
Oh.
And you had to go and you had to invite somebody else to lunch. And the shared experiences and, you know, the nuance of it was, or the kind of underlying assumption was that you would invite someone new every time. And the goal was to get to know other people, and you got free lunch as a result of it. That storytelling, that story sharing opens up our imagination, because we are wired to be educated by story and to tell stories. And that story sharing, I think, is one of the most powerful tools when it comes to navigating the complexity of the human experience and getting to a place of curiosity and an invitation to say, for this one, what does a meaningful engagement look like? Oh, now that I understand this about you, I can do this differently with you. And I remember doing a workshop, we were talking about psychological safety, and I had passionate healthcare workers in the room. And initially there was a lot of resistance, like, you don't understand the workload I have on my plate and, you know, different things. And as we worked through different aspects of the generational dynamics and the psychological safety, I saw this awareness go, oh, I need to put people before task. Psychological safety is about putting people before task. Does it mean task doesn't get done? No. It just means we focus on building the people capacity so that the task automatically gets done. Mm-hmm. It's an order of operations, not an either or. And you and I can talk about this conversation, and I think there's some more aspects of psychological safety that we need to circle back to. I really appreciate this conversation, and I hope leaders and listeners, you have grabbed something that is useful for you out of this conversation. And let's go back to this topic again, because it's a big one and it's an important one when it comes to all the diversities that we're navigating in the workplace. So stay tuned to Dissonance Disrupted for more of these great conversations. And Sherri, thank you. Any final thoughts as we wrap up?
Yeah, I do think that we've just scratched the surface on this, so I'm looking forward to more conversations about it, and we will be back.
Thanks for joining us on the Dissonance Disrupted podcast. We believe conversations don't end here, they begin here. If today sparked something for you, please take the time to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your network. And if you want to connect with us about today's show, we would love to hear from you. Visit us at www.dissonancedisrupted.ca for show notes, contact information, and more. Be sure to bring your coffee and join us next time on the Dissonance Disrupted podcast. Chat soon.
The Dissonance Disrupted podcast is hosted by Sherri Dockree and Nicki Straza. Editing and production by Sherri Dockree. Design and administration by Nicki Straza. Marketing and social media by Shaylin Wilson.